Good morning and welcome again, everybody. It's good to have you with us this month. Thank you to Adrian, who did that last month while I was on leave. So trust you found that GDPR information interesting. We'll recap a couple of those points this month, actually, just in the context of the opt-in section, one of the points to cover off today. So in light of that, it's prudent that we just give you a reminder that we're not a law firm, that we're really just trying to provide some direction in relation to some of the functionality that Eloqua can provide you, and obviously would need to direct you to your in-house counsel or external legal advice avenues in order to determine exactly the type of advice that you should be seeking. But rest assured, generally speaking, whatever those requirements are, you'll be able to achieve them with Eloqua. So that's the positive from that point of view. So this month we decided to focus on contact management, and there are a few key points that you saw that obviously caused you to register. And so in light of that, let's have a quick look at the agenda and see exactly what we're going to be covering. We'll look at the additional contacts to Eloqua and identify there are a range of ways that you can obviously get contacts into Eloqua, and we'll look closely at some of those. Also understanding forms and data quality and how some of the form processing steps can really be quite powerful in helping you, A, get data into the right location within the system, perform the necessary updates, etc. that need to happen, and so on and so forth, and some of the logic that you can apply in relation to form, how they work. Along the same lines, gating content, and it's at that opt-in stage where gating content or forms really play a big part. And then we'll have a look at some of the Eloqua updates as we do each month as well. So let's get started, and we'll jump into our first point, which is a best practice approach to adding contacts to Eloqua. And the first thing to really understand, I suppose, is, well, how do we get them into Eloqua? But long before we do that, we need to have some business processes in place. And so for the purposes of this exercise, what we're trying to understand today is, first of all, that we assume as a business that you have an agreed opt-in in place. And so as long as that's in place, that's our benchmark or our starting point, essentially, to continue this conversation. But to help me understand how you're currently getting contacts into Eloqua, could I ask you to respond to this question on screen and just give me an idea as to how today you're getting contacts into your instances of Eloqua. So this is the audience participation component. Okay, so CRM integration is winning. That should be SFTP, I think, by the way. So I apologize, but whoever answered the question, you got it right. That's SFTP. Well, it's really good that no one's answering I don't know. That's positive. So CRM integration, not surprisingly, is the number one, but Excel comes in pretty close behind, which is interesting. So let's show everybody the results. All right, so 50%, we're sort of sitting on 50% of attendees today are using CRM. But what I wanted to focus on a little bit too, though, is Excel, because Excel, while not, for some organizations, is not the primary way that contacts get into Eloqua, it is a way that contacts can get into Eloqua, whether it's information uploading after face-to-face events. There can be a range of ways that it will happen. Let's have a closer look, though, at some of those. So contacts can really come into Eloqua from a range of directions. We've just agreed that CRM is probably the lion's share of ways that can happen. SFTP is another. Ones you may not have thought about would be APIs. So if you're using different apps that would be using API technology. And so those apps could be things like ReadyTalk, like we're using ReadyTalk today for this particular webinar, WebEx, GoToWebinar, all of those third-party apps that integrate to webinar platforms, other ways that contacts can get into your instance of Eloqua. From a landing page point of view, you may have blog sign-ups, event registration, good old, contact us forms, and then of course there's the manual upload from Excel. You can see there are quite a few ways, and one of the points I think was covered last month from a GDPR point of view was really understanding how people can actually get into your system and making sure that you've got the correct opt-ins in place across those various channels to ensure that they have the best possible experience and understand what they're getting into when they give you that particular information. One of the more common ways, regardless of primary method that you use to get contacts into Eloqua, is this idea of using Excel to get contacts into Eloqua. So one of the key things to really understand here is the source of truth concept. So for most of you who have a CRM integrated to Eloqua, there can be many ways that integration works, but fundamentally and generally, the approach would be that the CRM really should be the source of truth, and that Eloqua will read information from the CRM. Now, the integration can be bidirectional, meaning that both information from Eloqua goes through to the CRM, and the best example of that is obviously things like digital body language. So if somebody's opened an email, been sent an email, visited a website, clicked on something, the CRM doesn't know that, only Eloqua knows that, but Eloqua is able to then integrate and share that information with the CRM. However, the CRM is definitely the source of truth when it comes to account-based information. So about the organization that I work for, the number of offices, the industry that I'm in, etc. All of that information is typically account-based information. So when it comes time to capturing information via forms or even uploading information, you really need to think through, okay, does this information get loaded into Eloqua, or should that information be loaded into the CRM and then synchronized through to Eloqua? The reason being that depending on the way your integration is set up, if you upload things into Eloqua and next time the integration kicks in, the CRM may win and wipe those updates that you've completed. So you really need to understand where the source of truth is. One of the best and easiest ways to make that happen and to certainly drive consistency is to use an Excel upload template. So whether you're going with most CRMs, you'll need to use a CSV file. As you're aware, with Eloqua, it doesn't have to be CSV, it can just be a regular Excel file. But either way, using a template will ensure consistency, especially around values that you have in drop-down pick lists, so single-select pick lists or multi-select pick lists. You want to make sure that you've got the exact value as it should be listed in those pick lists. Now, something that can be quite helpful is the concept of a unique ID. Now, most of you will understand from an Eloqua point of view that the email address is the unique ID. That's fine. And you know that when you upload some things or upload contacts into Eloqua, you can generally always create a shared list at the end of it. So if you've got no common point that links those people together, you might have a list of 1,000 contacts. Once you drop them into Eloqua, they're just in the mix. So if you want to be able to group those people together, perhaps adding a new field or another column to your upload called unique ID, and just give it any, use the date, something unique, but it would be the same number or identifier against every single one of those contacts that you've uploaded. The other part that's helpful, especially to just make sure you're comfortable that the updates have occurred and occurred correctly, is to create yourself a contact view. We use multiple contact views within Eloqua, and let me just quickly give you an idea as to what those contact views look like. Okay, so here we are looking at Eloqua. So the contact views, if I simply look at all of my contacts, I'll just do an asterisk search on the database. You can see here at the top of the screen the different views that are available. And once you click on those different views, you get a drop-down list, and those drop-down lists or drop-down views are it's all the same data. Instead of looking at 250 columns, the views enable you to reduce the number of columns, so it kind of makes sense. So for instance, if I look at CRM integration, so from a CRM integration, the things that I'm really looking to understand are to understand things like IDs, so contact IDs, account IDs, all of those various IDs that can exist. So I can just quickly scan through there and I can see quite easily, yes, those IDs exist, that's correct, etc. So it just makes it a lot easier for you by looking at those various views. Now, depending on your access levels to Eloqua, you may need to get your administrator to put that information together for you. That's easily done, simply going to settings, and it will depend on your access levels, but you can go to manage fields and views in the back end of Eloqua. And from fields and views, you can create a new view. So when you get here, there's two tabs, fields and views. Simply select view, and you can see all the different views that we've got there. So it's just a matter of creating the column headings. It literally takes 5 minutes to do. So it's quite a simple process. When uploading contacts, there's a few different ways that you can get those contacts into the system. You can go directly into a segment, which is probably what most people tend to do when I'm looking at customers and the way they're managing with Excel. That typically is the most common way to do things. The other one is to simply add them to the main database. So absolutely, again, you can do that, keeping in mind that if you don't add them to a shared list at the end of that process, there's nothing you can really do to find them all again. So if you want them in that same group, so you would just need to maybe just repeat the process. Take you a couple of minutes, no more. And this time, add them to a shared list at the end of that exercise. And the third one, which some of you may do, not all of you, but some of you may do, is also to upload contacts to a custom data object, or a CDO, as they're known within Eloqua. So they're kind of the three primary ways that you might be using Excel to get information into Eloqua. But again, let's have a closer look and show you those 3 steps so you can be clear on how they work. From the Eloqua home screen, or the My Eloqua screen, you can go to segments. And what I'll do is I'll just create into a brand segment. And so we click on the Create Segment button. I'll just choose a blank segment for the purposes of this exercise. So I just double click on that. And keeping in mind, you always need to save a segment in order to see the numbers. But you'll notice when you click on the plus screen, or the plus button, there's an option here to upload contacts. So when you click on Upload Contacts, I'd encourage you, the name needs to be unique, which is why Eloqua gives it this really long number, for instance. But I'd encourage you to actually give that a name, because that, if you decide to create a shared list at the end of the exercise, it's this name that is given to the shared list that you create. And then from there, it's really just an exercise in field mapping. So you can either click here on the cloud, which you can then go and find a relevant Excel file, or you can simply drag and drop onto the field here, and you'll move through to the first step, which is review, which just simply shows you the data to make sure that what you've uploaded is in fact the right piece of data. The third step is to map the fields, so we make sure the column headings in the Excel file match the contacts or field names within Eloqua, and then finishes the last step where the actual upload happens. Now you will be sent a confirmation email by Eloqua, so you'll be able to see if there's been any mistakes or errors in that upload, but generally speaking it's pretty seamless. So that's how you would add, again, upload contacts to a segment within Eloqua. The other one we talked about was simply going to the actual core database of Eloqua. And so that's actually the contact overview screen. So again, looking at contacts from the menu and the contact area, and you'll notice there's an upload button here. Now, if you don't see this upload button here at this screen or in the segment area of Eloqua, it just simply means your administrator has not given you access to do that. That's all it is. So, and you'll see the interface here is exactly the same. You'll also notice, again, in both areas, there are some options here. You can mass delete contacts, you can change email addresses. If you need to unsubscribe an entire list of people for whatever reason, maybe it's from another system you're using, you can update that information here as well. And then bounce back information as well. So that's your import purpose. Now, the custom data object of Eloqua is under custom objects. Now, this process will differ depending on the types of custom data objects that you might have in place. I'll just click on Ready Talk, which is one that we have loaded. Once you get in here, you can upload custom object records. Again, not many of you would do this, but I know there's certainly a couple of people on the call today who would use this process. And so that's how you generally go about uploading to a custom data object. Okay, let's move on to how smarter form processing steps can really help you in relation to what you're trying to do. Okay, here we go. We have a question. What would the custom objects be used for in comparison with a standard contact? Yeah. So Jamie, the main difference, let's go back a step. Why would you use a custom data object to start with? So typically the reason you would use a custom data object is because you have information that you collect against an individual that is a growing list of things. So, for example, you might be an Apple customer. And so you might have an iPad, an iPhone, an iMac, and a MacBook Air, and maybe a watch. I'm not sure what else is left there, but I'm sure there's other Apple products that you could have. But the point is that it's a one-to-many relationship. There's you, Jamie, as an individual, but then there's multiple assets that are linked directly to you. Now, when you use the Eloqua Contact, the contact is a one-to-one relationship. So I can't store, every time I add information to a field, it overrides what was there previously. So that's when a custom data object comes into play. And so we use the email address on the Eloqua Contact as the link to Jamie's information stored on a custom data object, where now we can view a whole range of assets that belong to Jamie. In this case, it's the iPad, the iPhone, the MacBook Air, the iMac, the Apple Watch, etc. So there's multiple pieces or a one-to-many relationship of that data. So if people are wanting to manually upload contacts into a custom data object, other applications that we've seen is where some clients, some larger clients, might be running very specific campaigns, in some cases with external agencies. And so they're wanting to cordon off areas within the database that the agency has access to. And so the custom data object is one way. It's not the only way, but it's one way that can be used to manage that process. Hopefully that answers your question. So forms and processing steps are really quite key, and forms can do a tremendous amount to help you in relation to what you're doing with being smarter about the way that you process data and information. But the form really is a way to achieve a lot of the automation that you're looking for when you're looking at a marketing automation platform. And one of the key ways that you do that in the back end of the form is with the conditionally step. So you've probably seen the conditional step. You may have used it. But the concept of conditionally, as sort of highlighted there, is to execute a particular processing step based on a certain condition. In a very simple example, you might run an event, and that event might have registration options for Auckland, Sydney, and Melbourne. And so when people register, they select one of those three options. And then in the back end of your form, you want to send a confirmation email. So you would use the conditional step to execute one of the three email sends. If the person selected Auckland, then you would send the send submitter an email using the conditional steps in order to do that. So conditionally can be applied. Once you start to understand the logic of how that works, you can see that you can do a lot of data cleansing based on some assumptions, so you need to be careful with your assumptions, but generally it can really be quite helpful in helping you. Now, in the construct of opt-ins and opt-outs, etc., obviously the form is quite critical in executing that process. I don't know if anybody noticed when you registered this month, but we required you to agree to opt-in, which I appreciate 99% of you have done already, but that was us having a little bit of play, just in relation to a little bit of GDPR type of behavior, but also getting a little bit more robust, I suppose, in that process of capturing that particular opt-in. What I'll do is I'll show you some of the changes we've made to the form processing steps so you can see how that particular piece was executed. That opt-in can be controlled by just simply using that single checkbox and conditions. So the single checkbox on the front of the form and then the conditions in your processing area. But remember also the key thing, if you're not aware, that the single checkbox has a value of on. I'll explain why that's important here in just a moment. So the front end of the form, most of you will be very familiar with that. One thing that we're noticing that we're doing a lot more now, whether it's a reflection of the growth of our business or in the inquiries that we're getting from different parts of the world, that we're jumping straight to country. We used to focus very much, I suppose it was a little insular of us within the states of Australia. Now we're focusing at the country level, and this becomes particularly important, especially from a GDPR point of view. We'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. But down the bottom here, you'll notice there was an option for you to agree to opt into communications. And so what we had to do there was determine what if somebody doesn't tick the box. Now, Marketing Cube is not a multinational conglomerate with offices on every continent. So we really don't have any fear of being chased by the European Union should we not follow the standards of the GDPR. The general assumption we have, though, the general feeling and observation that we have is that GDPR is really going to raise the tide and certainly raise the expectations for everybody in relation to the way we manage this process. So how does Eloqua help me do that? Well, the first thing I did was make a mistake in the process. And so let me show you the mistake I made. So if we go to the back end of the form and have a look at the processing steps, many of you will be familiar with this option, which is to subscribe contacts globally. So I came to this particular step and I went, okay, let's have a look at conditions. And so I've got here that I only want to subscribe somebody globally if they've ticked the box called I agree to opt into communications. And that's what I mean when I said the checkbox equals on, that's what I mean. So the value is on. Okay, so I went ahead and did that. The problem was when I did the testing, I got the confirmation email, I was added to the shared lists, I was added to a program to go through to the CRM. The other quite tricky part was that because Eloqua was confused over, well, actually, I suppose I was confused as the user, but Eloqua somehow managed to merge both of these confirmation pages into one big page, okay? So clearly something was wrong. The problem was that what I really needed to do was actually apply that conditional step to every single processing step. So all of these processing steps now must have, they will only execute if the person has actually ticked the box. Now, if some of you didn't tick the box, you would have gone to this page, which let me just see if I can quickly get on the screen here for you. This is what we call our generic did not opt in page. So, so the way this works is if somebody goes ahead and fills in the form, but they do not tick the box to opt in, then they're presented with what we're calling our generic did not opt in screen. Now, in my case, it's personalized, excuse me, because my laptop has cookies on it and it knows who I am. But for somebody who may come to that page for the very first time, the screen that you can see right now that says hello Derek, it would just simply say hello. And so what we do there basically is say to them, hey, if you're not going to opt in, I'm afraid we can't really talk to you. And so the other key thing in those processing steps is to make sure that we don't collect any of the data. And so that's why on every single one of the processing steps on the form, we set the condition that they do not execute unless that box has been ticked. Because, I mean, it just doesn't make sense, right? You can't collect the data if somebody doesn't opt in. There's a bit of a moral issue and potentially a legal issue at play there as well. Certainly more so for the European folks than for us here in Asia Pac. But for many of you, and I'm just looking carefully at who will call today, I know some of you certainly are international firms and have registered offices within the EU. So there are ramifications potentially for you, but hopefully you've had time to talk that through with your relevant legal teams, etc. So back to Eloqua and those form processing steps. So the key thing there, as I said, was to make sure that the conditional step was like this. Now, you'll notice that the value here in the drop-down, there are two options. One is that it is exactly on, which means it's ticked. The other is not exactly on, which means it's not ticked. And so the not exactly is the value that we use to drive people through to the information page you saw there just a moment ago with the guy sitting on the hill with the dark clouds looking very, very dreary, which was deliberate, I assure you. So that's one way that you can help really be confident in that the only way people can get into your Eloqua database via a form, at least, is to really manage that process carefully. And again, it really makes it a much better idea if you're using templates. So you definitely want to be using form templates and having this information, hardwired into your forms. We've had to go back sort of retroactively and change some of the forms. We're still not done. There's still more forms that need to be updated, but we're kind of working through it as a bit of a side project. So that's one way to help you manage your forms better. Okay, so a question here from Yana. Derek, I noticed that your form is active. How do you make the form status active? And reporting-wise, what's the difference of report generated from an active form versus a draft form? Okay, Yana, let's first of all understand what active and draft mean within the world of Eloqua. So when we see the word active, and it's not just against a form, you'll have seen the same active against a landing page or an email form, for example. When you see the word active, what that's telling you is that those assets are currently being used as part of a campaign canvas, and the campaign canvas is active. Now, as you know, when you create a landing page in Eloqua, and as soon as you assign a subdomain and then a pretty URL, and you save it, that page is live. Now, it's live on the internet, and if you have a form sitting on it, it's working. It's functioning, and it's live and is able to be used. It'll only have the word active appear next to it if it's actually part of an existing campaign canvas that is active. So what is the difference? The question there you asked, what is the difference from a draft form versus an active form? It just simply means that one is included on a campaign canvas and one is not. That's really the only difference. From a reporting point of view, the reporting is not so much around whether or not the form is active or is in draft. From a reporting point of view, it's really about the submission data. So whether that form is currently involved in a campaign or it's not, you apply a date range to when you want information about that particular form, and Eloqua will return that information to you. If you want to look at form submission data in the specific context of a campaign, then you would go through Insight looking at it from a campaign point of view. If you want to have a look at the form data all over, regardless of which campaign the form was included in, then you would go into Insight looking at the form information, and then you would drill through that way. So depending on the information you want will depend on the type of report that you would generate. That answers your question, Yana. Okay, let's jump on to point 3, which is a little bit of what we just covered, but let me just dive a little bit deeper for you in a couple of ways. Okay, thank you, Yana. In 3 other areas. So there are essentially 3 aspects to this opt-in scenario that you need to manage. One of them, first of all, is that global subscription. And as you know, as soon as you put a contact into Eloqua, you're able to email somebody. So that's a global subscription. Then below that, we have subscription management. We'll have a close look at that in a moment. And then perhaps below that again, you might have preference management. So let's have a closer look and understand, well, how does Eloqua really interpret those 3 things? So when we look at global subscription, that's easy. In Eloqua, that's globally subscribed. And that's kind of the default. As soon as a contact goes in, they're globally subscribed. Now, from a subscription management point of view, as an Eloqua user, you would really see that more email groups. Then you might drop down to preference management. So preference management could be the types of communications, and you could represent those as a single checkbox, for instance, on the Eloqua Contact. Now, depending on how massive that subscription center is, it could also be a candidate for a custom data object, but often it's easier to keep it directly on the contact because it's usually not that big. We're not talking hundreds of options, or if you are talking hundreds of options, that might be a slightly different discussion. So that's really how Eloqua manages those things for you, or the subscription constructs for you. And so GDPR, where does that fit into all of this? And we don't mean to harp on this. We covered it last month. But as we said, the expectations for that consumers are going to have in relation to the way they interact with companies, certainly those that are based in the EU, is that it really is going to lift the bar for all marketers. Certainly that's our view, and we're starting to really see that already as we deal with a range of different customers here across Australia and New Zealand and across Asia. That, some of those companies will have peer officers or colleagues in Europe, and they don't want to have 2 processes. They don't want to have 2 systems to manage these things. And as a brand and as a global brand, they need to have a consistent experience that they're driving. So we think it's really going to be a game changer, and that's why at Marketing Cube, personally as a business, we're looking to move in that direction ourselves and using Eloqua to help us achieve that. So there are three key things that you really need to focus on, and we spoke about these a little bit last month, but I just wanted to revisit them in the context of today's meeting, because in this area of collection of personal data, you need to be aware that that collection process is really not just Eloqua and Eloqua forms. As we looked at earlier, how do contacts get into Eloqua? From a contact management point of view, we need to understand the APIs, we need to understand apps, we need to understand the CRM. Is there SFTP? Are there Excel uploads? There are a whole range of ways that people can get into Eloqua. And at the same time, there's technology that can certainly help, but there also needs to be business processes in place to manage that and make sure that information flows correctly. Now, the management of personal data certainly talks about security and protection of personal data as well. So the managing of the personal data, you could think about, well, really who has access to it, what can we do with it, how do we use it, how long do we keep it for. The protection of personal data is, how many people are within your organization have the ability to log into Eloqua and download 3.5 million contacts out of Eloqua. Does everybody have access, or is that something just the administrator has access to? Something for you to think about, and just do a little bit of a security audit potentially to make sure that you're comfortable with those levels of security across the system. And certainly, again, if you do have registered offices within the EU, you'll very shortly, as of the 25th of May, be legally obliged to have the processes in place. And many of you, again, those larger firms based in the EU, will also have a data steward. So this is somebody whose key responsibility, or their only responsibility, is the management of personal data as captured by your organization. So they're the three key areas that you really need to focus on as a marketer. So one of the questions we wanted to cover off today for you was also in relation to how to store that opt-in data. What do you do with it? So the key thing to understand here is that, and it's kind of that second point there in that sentence, is that simply relying on Eloqua's ability to capture digital body language is not always going to be enough, because Eloqua only holds on to that for 25 months. So that's not a long-term strategy. So we're talking there about custom data objects. And so with custom data objects, the ability to store information is kind of forever. So you don't need to worry about that. So the concept of the custom data object is that you would be able to, using processing steps on a form, for instance, to take information from the Eloqua Contact within the main database, and then you can add that to a particular custom data object that you would use potentially for opt-in information. And so that would enable you to store all of the required information that you need about, what was the date and time of the opt-in, what was the email address used of the opt-in, was there a campaign associated with that, what was the form, and then also as a place to store any personal or personally identifiable information that you might have about the person. Because one of the requirements under GDPR is for a person to be able to request that information and to receive that information in a commonly recognized format. So that would probably be Excel, CSV, something quite simple, and so you could extract that quite simply from a custom data object within Eloqua. So that's one solution to think about if necessary for your organization, and we're happy to have a chat with you if you need to understand that. So the big so what in relation to GDPR, certainly from an Asia Pac point of view, is, well, really, why do I need to worry about this? Certainly the concept of a fine is, unless you have offices in the EU, you don't have to worry about that fine. So a little old Marketing Cube, we don't have any registered entities within Europe, and so there's very little chance they would ever come after us. But we don't believe that's the point. Look, I'm sure your CFO would see that as the point. We don't really see that as the point necessarily. The point is that consumers are going to experience something quite a bit different, and you don't want to be left behind. You don't want to be left with people thinking, oh wow, they're not doing a double opt-in, or well, they're not really giving me easy access to my data, so what are they doing with my data? You don't want people thinking that dealing with you is less secure than potentially dealing with another organization that might be EU-based or of a global brand. So that's really the point we're trying to make from why we should be interested in GDPR and why we certainly are interested as Marketing Cube. What we like to try and do each month is really focus on some of the changes and then the new enhancements that we're aware of. Now, much of this information we're able to source from exactly the same place you can source it, but we'll just have a quick look and see how else or what else we can add. Something that happened actually just last week, and some of you may or may not have noticed this, is the Help Center has had a bit of a major overhaul. Same URL, you don't have to try and struggle to find it. It's still in the same location. You can access it from within Eloqua, but it's now a completely responsive experience, which is kind of nice. So first thing I noticed is certainly some cosmetic changes in the way that you access the system. Yeah, so the new Help Center, 3 primary areas. Let's, for example, if you were to click on sort of Get Started, you then arrive at a new screen, and you see the approach here is quite different. Instead of you can still do a keyword search. You'll notice there's still the search function here at the top of the screen, but they're really trying to come at it from a type of question, like a business problem or a campaign challenge, for instance. And so if I'm coming in here and I'm a fairly new user, maybe something like, create my first segment is something that is of interest. So I click on that, come through to the next screen, and so now I get a nice description about what a segment is, why I would use it. They're going to walk me through some key points on what that means, what I'll need in relation to access, obviously, so you're going to have access to segments. And then it's basically they walk you through a kind of a wizard, a learning process. So for those of you that are newer to Eloqua, or if you have colleagues who are new to Eloqua, I'd really encourage you to have a good look at the new Help Center. I think this new approach is quite helpful. So I'll leave that with you to explore. But as far as the actual updates that are coming in relation to Eloqua, there's been a few, and we'll just focus on some of the highlights to give you an idea. Certainly additional changes to the new email design editor, one being the ability to resize column widths, which is kind of nice. You can also send emails as plain text. Probably should have been there in the first release, but that's okay. I can't remember the last time I even was sending an email in plain text, but depending on your audience, that may be something that's helpful for you. And you can also write right to left. And that may be helpful for some of our clients within the Asian market or in the Middle East. So if that's something that you would prefer to be able to do, which obviously would make sense depending on your geography and area, then that would be a nice enhancement. The other one is there's a new dashboard coming, and if you go into top line, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second, we've got a little bit of time, you'll see a GIF. At the moment, all we've got is a GIF that shows you this little new database dashboard. But I'm very keen to close look at this because it really answers the question, who in my contact database can I reach and is actively engaged with my emails? I like that. Now, I do that today using segments. I slice and dice the segment, different filters, different time frames, different campaigns. But I'm curious to see the dashboard and the way the dashboard shows that information. And I believe this is the first of a few more dashboards that are coming that are oriented in that type of direction. So yeah, more coming from that point of view, which is good. For those customers who are also Oracle BlueKai customers, the BlueKai Data Activation app is now generally available. It was in beta for a little while, but it's now generally available. So for those of you that are using BlueKai with Eloqua, that will be good news. And the other big enhancement is now the LinkedIn Sales Navigator. So again, excited to announce the new integration between Oracle Eloqua Profiler and LinkedIn Sales Navigator. So these are available, but you do need to be a LinkedIn customer. So not just a user and have an account, but actually a bill-paying LinkedIn Sales Navigator customer. And so you'll find, again, information within the Help Center. We'll provide some information as well following the webinar today. But the other thing to look at and focus on is when is all of this happening. So the key thing to understand with any of these updates is which pod you exist on, your instance of Eloqua. So how do you find your pod number? So your pod number is actually in your URL. And so for us, you can see we're on pod 1, which is P01. So we're on pod 1. So if you have a look at your URL within Eloqua, you'll be able to see quite clearly where you are. And then this information will make a lot more sense to you. So this is the schedule from Eloqua as to when those updates will happen. Most of our clients here within the Asia Pac region are on pod 1 or pod 2, I think 6 and 7 primarily. 7 is the Australian data center. But of course, our American friends do everything well. I suppose it's global, right? So I've tried to make this a little bit more friendly for you, although I apologize to my Asian and Kiwi friends. It is based in Sydney, but I almost went cross-eyed doing this, so I didn't want to have to do like every time zone across the region. But this at least gives you an idea. So pod 7, which is the Australian-based pod or data center, it's sort of 8 p.m. on a Friday till 5 Saturday, which makes a lot more sense. So 12 p.m., 9 p.m., etc. So yeah, it makes it a little bit easier for you to understand what's going on. So once you've logged into Topliners, on the far right-hand side of the screen is the Oracle Marketing Cloud Customer button. Once you click on that one, that screen will refresh. And then over on the far left-hand side, you'll see the Eloqua area, and specifically it's the release information that you're looking for. So when you click on release information, you'll arrive at this screen, and you can see this is where I've clearly managed to get the information from. So really just taking a consolidation of that information on the left, and I'm not sure how well that GIF is going to show for you, but there you'll be able to see a range of some of those different changes, etc., and how they work. There's more information available. This is the timing schedule you can see below. But again, once you're in Eloqua, if you just go back to into Topliners, hit the Topliners logo at the top of the screen, you'll always get back to the home page. And again, so it's the Oracle Cloud Customers, and then straight through to the Top Center. If I could be selfish, and I apologize for the crash in the system now, I'm not really sure what happened. It didn't seem to be the internet. I'm not sure if it was Ready Talk or the internet, but anyway, if I could just get you to give me an idea that you, just on how helpful today's webinar was in relation to what we talked about. If there aren't any other questions, please feel free to use the chat function in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Part of today's webinar was driven by a member of the user group from the US, a gentleman who works at a university, had raised a few of the points that we covered today. Just recently started working with Eloqua, found the user group, joined up and shot me an email and put this one forward as a suggestion. I thought, well, there's a lot there, I think, for everybody to learn from. So let me know if you do have any questions. Here we go. Neil, what sort of data should be captured in a CDO for GDPR? First and last name, email, and data submission. Sure, Neil. So that would certainly be the basics. Yes, first name, last name, email, data submission. Depending on the level of email groups and subscriptions you've got, you may want to separate that out by global subscription versus also looking at email group level subscription and unsubscribe information as well. The key thing is if you want that data to be in a state that should somebody inquire and want to know what information you have about them, you typically would probably want to be in a position to do one export versus having to do multiple exports from multiple systems. So that probably would be something you really should go back and have a chat to in-house counsel about, and what are the requirements based on the legislation that we, or the regulation I should say, that we as a company need to provide. So if I come to you and say, I want to see all of the personal information you have about me, where is that information going to come from? And so you want to make sure that you've got it as much as possible within one place, because I would imagine in an organization your size, there's potential that there'd be information in the CRM, there'd be certainly some within Eloqua, and potentially even ERP systems as well. So hopefully that answers your question. Not a problem. Happy to help. Well, if that's it, I think we might have an early mark with 6 minutes to go. Thanks, everybody. We'll stay online here, but thank you very much and have a great day.